I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Labour's leader, Jeremy Corbyn. Nice to see you. Should we get our mutual celebration for the Arsenal victory out the way first?
Oh, well, they're never over, are they?
Well,
did you enjoy it?
Yeah, well, I went with low expectations and they were massively superseded.
You know what underdogs win?
Well, got a couple more weeks to see whether that will turn out to be the case. But look, I'm delighted that you've joined me, and obviously this whole issue of security is front of mind. We here at Peston on Sunday have identified at least 17 occasions you voted against anti-terror laws designed to keep us safe. Do you now regret voting in that way?
First of all, let's be absolutely clear. What happened in Manchester was abominable. The deaths are appalling and the trauma will never go away. And the response of the people of Manchester in Albert Square less than 18 hours after the attack was remarkable, in that they called for unity of communities in order to defeat the terrorism that has been perpetrated by this individual against those people. And I think we've got to be clear that is a response.
Secondly, no, totally, but nonetheless, people have got a choice on June the 8th, and the choice will partly be about who they think is going to keep them safest.
OK, on your point about anti-terror laws, yes, I have been assiduous in my scrutiny of anti-terror laws
voting against
in Parliament, and voting against, in common with David Davis, on occasions Theresa May and others, on the basis that anti-terror laws are important, but they must be subject to judicial oversight. My concern was always we were going down the road of executive orders, executive detention and executive control. Everything must be subject to a judicial process. Why did I form this opinion? Because I represent a constituency that had, still has, a large Irish population, many of whom were detained under the Prevention of Terrorism Act in the 1970s, again without judicial oversight. It was the attempted criminalisation of large numbers of young people, which of course drives them in a very bad direction. So my point on the anti-terror laws was not that you don't need an effective anti-terror strategy. You must have an independent judicial oversight of what goes on.
But you have been vocal in your opposition to the monitoring of suspected terrorists. Was that a mistake?
I've been vocal in my opposition to executive control orders that are not subject to judicial oversight.
No, on TPIM notices, which actually, you know, the former terrorist czar Alex Carlisle says don't go far enough in providing us with restrictions on the behaviour of suspected terrorists. You said that they were a very, very serious attack on our liberty, and it's important that we oppose them.
Yes, because of the question of judicial oversight. That was the point. I do support and work with the police and our security services on intelligence-led actions. And what this government has not...
But they would argue that if they have to act swiftly, there are times when judicial oversight is not appropriate.
Well, they can intervene on the basis of suspicion at any time of a criminal intent taking place. They can do that anyway. That's what the police are for.
But so to be absolutely clear, were you to become Prime Minister, you would, if necessary, enact more restrictive laws on to monitor, restrict the activities of potential terrorists. Because let's be clear, I mean, MI5 says there are, as you know, at least 3,000 individuals in this country who are a direct threat to our security, and possibly 23,000 in total who could be a great threat to the security and lives of our people.
Yes, and those people are presumably, I hope, being monitored on an intelligence-led basis, but it seems that the cuts in police numbers have led to some very dangerous situations emerging. It's also a question of a community response as well, so that where an imam, for example, alerts the police that he's very concerned about somebody, I would hope they would act. And I hope they would have the resources to act as well.
Now, in the past, you have regularly described terrorists in terms of your actions and sometimes in terms of your words as essentially freedom fighters. Do you regret that?
No, I've never used those words.
But in
no, I've never used those words. I do not believe that individual acts of terror are acceptable in any circumstances, because if you want political change, then you pursue political change through democratic means. The problem in some countries is when the democratic process is closed down, other things take over.
You explicitly said that you've not talked with the IRA, but your Shadow Home Secretary says that's not right.
I have not spoken to the IRA. I have in the past,
shared a
still do,
with a former...
often meet people from Sinn Féin, and my
but former convicted IRA terrorists?
Indeed.
So why is that not talking to the IRA?
I've met former prisoners who told me they were not in the IRA. But I have met former prisoners with my eyes open on it, on the basis that there had to be a development of a peace process in Northern Ireland. And I think we should look at the awful period of the Troubles in Northern Ireland and the attempt to get a military solution to those problems as something that we all learn a lesson from. And surely the ceasefires, the two ceasefires, followed by the Good Friday Agreement and the acceptance of the differing historical traditions between the nationalist and the unionist communities in Ireland, is something that has brought about a long-term peace from which the rest of the world has learnt many lessons. Surely we could give credit to all those unionists and Republicans who brought that about.
But people are looking for a leader most likely to bring greater security to the country. If you look at those who succeeded in brokering peace with the IRA, Tony Blair, John Major, they were people who were much more explicitly opposed to the IRA than you ever were.
They brought about a peace process. I remember having quite long discussions with John Major about this after he ceased to be Prime Minister, about the difficulties of achieving it and the need to have lots of conduits of discussion. And if you trace the history back of the Northern Ireland peace process, the crucial moment was probably the way in which John Hume of the SDLP and Gerry Adams of Sinn Féin stepped aside from their own comfort zone, if you like, and held private discussions to bring about that accord, which brought a degree of unity on the nationalist side, which meant we then moved on to the historic agreement with the Ulster Unionists.
Now, you obviously do believe that negotiation talking is terribly important. After the Paris attacks, you said that we needed a more urgent effort to reach a negotiated settlement of the civil war in Syria and the end to the threat from ISIS. That did sound like you would be prepared to talk to ISIS.
No, I've never said I'd talk to ISIS. What I did...
But that was the implication.
Well, that's an implication you have chosen to draw from it. It was not the implication at all.
So how do we how do we find a peace if unlike the IRA, we can't talk to them?
Look, if we don't bring about a ceasefire in Syria between the various warring factions, some of which are nearer to ISIS than others, some of which are very pro-Western, some of which are Syrian government, some of which are pro-Russian, there has to be a peace process there. There also has to be a serious question mark about where ISIS gets its funds from, where it gets sells its oil to, where it gets its arms from, and look at those connections all across the region. And also, if I may say so, you can't exclude the huge spaces of Libya that have no effective government in them whatsoever, and therefore are a breeding ground for the most awful things. I think we have to look at Libya as well. Now,
Diane Abbott has just said on the BBC, in relation to her history with the IRA and Sinn Féin, it was 34 years ago. I had an afro, the hairstyle has gone, the views have gone. Lots of people will see that as trivialising a very important shift in her position.
Well, Diane's hairstyle is a matter for Diane.
But views on the IRA, most people would say, are somewhat more important than how you wear your hair.
Well, you raised the question of the hair, if I may say so, not me.
Well, no, she raised it.
Oh, OK. Well, you've reported on the raising of it. All right, never mind. Listen...
But is that appropriate language for somebody who, under a Labour government, would be Home Secretary?
Look, we learnt, all of us, a lot from the whole experience of Northern Ireland. Remember what it was like. You and I are old enough to remember exactly what it was like in the late 70s and early 80s. Yep. The military presence all over Northern Ireland, the huge divide between communities, the lack of any communication between communities, the idea there would be a military solution when we knew there wouldn't be. Listen, I remember arguing with many people in Parliament. And when Ian Paisley was thrown out of Parliament for accusing the Prime Minister of talking to the Republicans, which she denied she was, and it turns out she probably was, I actually defended him on being thrown out of Parliament.
Look, I have to just push you on this. Would Diane, given the sort of things you just said, be your Home Secretary?
Diane is our Home Affairs spokesperson, and I'm looking to appoint our shadow cabinet.
Jeremy, thank you so much. Don't go away. We've got more from the Labour leader in just a few moments. Welcome back to Peston on Sunday. Jeremy resisted the temptation to disappear to his allotment, and he's still here. But first, Anushka.
Thanks, Robert. Lots of reaction from Twitter, including from The Sun's Tom Newton-Dunn, who quotes Jeremy Corbyn saying, "I've never spoken to the IRA. I've met former prisoners who told me they weren't members," to which Tom adds, "despite their convictions." Also, lots of people tweeting about Diane Abbott's comments about her afro, including Tim Shipman from the Sunday Times, who says, former Tory spad, "I was going to get a haircut next week, but now I'm worried it will change my world view." Robert.
So I just want to pick up on a couple of other points connected to these security issues. You are a great believer in Britain's humanitarian tradition of taking political refugees. Given what we now know about Salman Obeidi, were we right to allow his parents into the country?
If they had a case for humanitarian protection or full asylum on the basis of being under threat of social, religious or political persecution, yes. Are we right to monitor and examine such people's views? Yes. Whether that happened to his parents, I don't know. That will no doubt come out of the investigation. But I think we should be clear that under the 1951 Convention, we have a clear obligation to take people who are under serious threat. That was the whole point about it.
Now, you've said very clearly that you're not a pacifist. What military engagements by Britain since the war have been appropriate?
I think where we've been involved in UN peacekeeping operations, that is appropriate. Where we've helped with bringing about ceasefires and ending a civil war, such as in Zimbabwe in 1981 during the independence period, there was important. Also, I think the British support for the UN operation in East Timor helped to bring an end to what was a truly appalling civil war. I think our forces have done amazingly good work in the Mediterranean in protecting humanitarian, well, helping people who would otherwise be...
Any Tony Blair's engagements?
I think the question of Sierra Leone is an important one because...
Was he right to intervene in Sierra Leone? Would you have done so?
It's a difficult one because I need to go back into all of the cases around it. I didn't oppose it at the time.
Kosovo?
Put it that way. Kosovo, I had my doubts because of the degree of bombing that went on, and I thought there should have been more efforts put into a UN brokered peace process, but also, crucially, looking beyond that.
But learning about the genocide, would you think you were wrong then?
No, I would also say where there is a clear threat of genocide that can be prevented. I'm thinking here Rwanda, Burundi, where there was no intervention of any meaningful size by anyone, despite the UN wanting to do so. I thought something could and should have been done there, and I've been in Rwanda and Burundi and spoken to people there who went through the horrors of that genocide.
Now,
and it seems to me there's a sort of sometimes different calculations made about issues in Africa compared to the rest of the world.
Now, I want to move on to your broader plans.
Yes.
Particularly your plans for public services. Can I just ask a simple question? Do you regard the Institute for Fiscal Studies as the best arbiter of the credibility of spending and taxing plans?
Well, they're independent. They are obviously extremely thoughtful. They're robust in their investigation of people's economic plans and robust in their examination of public finances. So, yes, of course, they're very important.
So they say that your plans to tax would not raise the 49 billion that you hope, but would only raise 40. So where's the other 9 going to come from?
I would question them on this because one of the taxes, for example, about overseas property would be a completely new tax, and they therefore have no basis on which they can examine the effect of it or otherwise, and we're happy to discuss that.
But even without that, they say there is a big hole in your plans. Which other taxes are going to go up to pay
Well,
for
we
that?
dispute that because we believe that our figures are robust, and we're more than happy to discuss it with them. As I said, there are new taxes involved.
OK, we understand that on that you disagree with them. But they also say on corporation tax, you've created this illusion that this is a pain-free tax for people. They say it's inevitable that prices that companies charge will go up if you put up corporation tax. They also say that they will almost certainly pay employees less.
Well,
so you're carrying out a deceit on the British people by somehow, you know, putting forward the idea that if you put up company taxes...
Hang on, Robert, you're telling me raising taxes is a deceit on the British people if we raise it on
because you're implying that ordinary people won't pay for these higher taxes.
You can't really mean that. What we're saying is corporation tax was at 28% in 2010. We are proposing to put it back up to 26%, which is obviously less. This government is proposing to reduce it further and actually hand roughly £60 billion over to corporations and in tax relief at the top end between now and 2022. We think that instead of doing that, we should be asking those corporations to pay a bit more, asking the very, very wealthiest to pay a bit more. The alternative is what? More food banks, more homeless people, more people on housing waiting lists, more queues in our hospitals, more than 1 million people already waiting for social care. There is a social crisis looming in Britain that cannot be resolved by continuing tax giveaways to the wealthiest in our society.
Now, I've got to ask you a very important question because it comes from our viewers. As you know, we always ask our viewers for a question.
Good.
And this is from Westminster Mum. It says, don't Labour costings assume all big businesses will stay in the UK and not move elsewhere if you put up corporation tax? What if they leave?
Well, they're still going to be doing business in Britain, and our whole tax idea and our whole tax model is that you're taxed on the business you do in Britain. So if you sell a vast amount of coffee in Britain, then we ask you to pay the tax in Britain for the coffee you've sold rather than pay it in Luxembourg, which clearly could not consume, even if everybody was on a sort of treble espresso every day, could not consume the same amount of coffee as this country.
And then very briefly, and I'm sorry, it's got to be brief because we're pretty much out of time, putting up the national minimum wage even for young people, there are lots who fear that young people simply won't get jobs if they become more expensive.
Well, most companies that pay very low wages could well afford to do so. Our benefit system, in-work...
But aren't you worried about a rise in unemployment?
Our in-work benefit system, to some extent, subsidises employers who could well afford to pay more. Where there are small businesses involved, and I have had discussions with the Federation of Small Businesses about this whole concept, there has to be a pathway through to it, either through tax relief or subsidy or something to get there. But the principle has to be...
So you recognise this is a problem for businesses?
For the small businesses, yes. For the bigger businesses, it's not.
Jeremy Corbyn, very good.
Can I give you a present?
See you, if you like.
It's in the Arsenal colours. It's in the
Arsenal colours. I've already got a colour. I think we knew that your colours were similar. Anyway, very nice to see you.